Thank you for attending this presentation. Just as a reminder, this presentation is related to a paper, and I will also be available for questions. So this is a summary of the findings of the paper and the major points, but there's a lot more details to be had that can be found either in the paper or in talking to me after this presentation. My name is Chad McGuire. I'm a professor and chair at the Department of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and I'm speaking about sea level rise, coastal ecosystems, and development priorities, the U.S. dilemma. The United States is a coastal nation. It has significant coastal development and it has significant coastal areas. In terms of sea level rise, there's observed and predicted sea level rise in the United States and of course across the world, but specifically for the United States. That threatens many of the coastal ecosystems already have significantly degraded many coastal ecosystems through a mix of development and sea level rise, but now mainly through sea level rise, but also development and redevelopment. Coastal climate change is threatening a lot of coastal habitat in the United States. As far as the policy issues, current policy favors protection and enhancement of coastal development in the United States at the federal, state, and local levels. All policy right now favors coastal development. There's already a significant existing development in most of the coastal areas of the United States, particularly you think of coastal cities in the United States. Most of the major cities are coastal in the United States. And protection of development spurs new investment in redevelopment and new development. One of the interesting things in terms of findings is that not only do storms, coastal storms like hurricanes and other disasters that happen in the United States along the coastlines get a lot of investment, including public dollar investment in terms of disaster relief for redevelopment of things that have been injured or harmed or destroyed. But there's also a lot of financing that comes in to spur new additional development above and beyond that redevelopment in these sensitive coastal areas. And there's continued financial investment that will prevent meaningful coastal ecosystem protection. The problem for policymakers is that major federal, state, and local policies favor this coastal development of coastal ecosystem protection or over coastal ecosystem protection. So removing subsidies and supports for coastal development and redevelopment is necessary to protect coastal ecosystem assets. And internalizing both the costs of climate change and the inherent values of coastal ecosystems will be difficult at best. The US is a coastal nation. As you can see in the photo on the left, this is the New England area of the United States, but this is the same around the coast. Populations are densely located along coastal areas. Most of the United States, most of the population lives in coastal areas. And to the right, you can see that most of the economic activity that occurs in the United States also occurs in these major coastal cities and coastal areas. And as a result of that, there is an emphasis, a sort of path dependence that's created where, these coastal areas are incredibly important, not just because people live there, but also because most of what people do in the economic activity and well-being of the United States is directly connected to these geophysical locations. In terms of coastal ecosystem services, here's a list on the left of the types of services generally found in coastal ecosystems. And then across the right, you'll find the different types of coastal ecosystems and, relatively speaking, whether or not they have these particular services. And what I'm showing here in, relatively speaking, the red, the yellow, and the green is how the US internalizes or identifies or acknowledges some of these services. And mainly the green are sort of what you would call those direct ecosystem services that are directly related to economic values that are normally identified. And raw materials and tourism are the major areas where most of these ecosystems and the services they provide are identified and readily acknowledged. The yellow identifies parts of these ecosystem services that are not really well defined. There's some of their services and values are incorporated into economic decision making, but most of them are not. And then finally, the red show things that, for the most part, they are not. These ecosystem services are really not neither identified nor really put into the economic calculus and decision making, certainly at policy level in the United States. In terms of the values, the relative values of these services. And it's important to know that, the estimates vary significantly, but without a doubt, globally speaking, it's entirely likely that ecosystem services of coastal ecosystems, particularly in places like the United States around the world where most of the economic activity and population exists in these coastal areas, those services provide a disproportionate amount of value, something that has been calculated by Costanza et al. And some others to be a multiplier of global GDP in a given year. So it's a lot. There's significant value there. One of the problems with identifying that value and relating it to what the US is actually doing is that here you'll see what the United States is spending on coastal disasters. So this is just disaster relief spending. This isn't about building things necessarily or economic development proactive. This is about responding to actual harm that occurs, usually through hurricanes and flooding and other natural or climate induced, not so much natural anymore, events. And you see from 1964 fiscal year 1964 through fiscal year 2020, you'll see in the gold or in the yellow, depending on how you view this, the actual appropriation that the federal government, the Congress of the federal government in the United States appropriated, the amount of dollars it appropriated in billions to deal with natural disasters. And these are controlled. So 1964 dollars are the same types of dollars and the same value dollars as 2020. So it's an apples to apples comparison. That's important. And in the blue, you'll see the blue represents supplemental appropriations. So the difference between what was actually thought was going to be spent on responding to natural disasters and what actually needed to be spent. And you'll see in some areas that it's so large, 2005, et cetera, that you have to move to the inset to see the actual level of supplemental appropriation that's hitting close to 90 or 100 billion dollars in a given year. What that tells us is a couple of things. It tells us that the costs associated with living along coastlines is getting a lot higher, particularly because the risk is increasing, the number of disasters and the cost and the amount spent to remedy those disasters are increasing significantly. But it also tells us that the United States is spending more than it thinks it should. And then you can even see that's when in more recent years, you can see that Congress is incorporating those larger expenses into new appropriations. The gold bars are getting higher, which means Congress is putting more money aside to deal with disasters. But even then, they're still spending more than they thought they would because those disasters are happening and they're more intense and they're more frequent than thought, particularly in the more recent past 20 to 30 years. So that's significant because what that says is that the United States is investing more and more money into these coastal areas. There are a number of added complexities on top of all of this. There's all of this intertwining sort of, infrastructure, financial infrastructure. There's, coastal investment, coastal real estate, the communities that are coastal communities, how they receive their public revenues from local tax base, the real estate markets. There's an entire industry and an intertwining web of connected sort of vested interests in coastal real estate and coastal investment that makes it really hard to prioritize and identify coastal ecosystem resources, the ecosystem values against the actual sort of development that's happening in coastal areas in the United States. So in terms of coastal development and ecosystem decline, the US is experiencing significant coastal wetland loss. It's lost about half of its entire coastal wetlands and currently averaging about 100,000 acres per year. The rate of coastal development is increasing in recent years. The highest rates occur, and interesting enough, and you can read more about this in the paper, ask me questions, but the highest rates have been found to occur immediately after coastal disasters. What that means is that people are not only redeveloping these coastal areas that have just experienced flooding and other disaster-related events, but then they're developing new additional development. And the financing system is accommodating this not only by financing from disaster relief, but also financing new development at the same time. And ultimately, this inhibits an adoption of direct climate change policies that attempt to internalize risk. It is really hard to develop policy that goes against this trend. The result is current federal policy places development over coastal ecosystem protection. And climate change will only exacerbate this problem. In other words, for example, building like massive seawalls to protect against encroaching seas, so you lose all of those ecosystems, the coastal ecosystem characteristics. And until there's a full accounting of ecosystem services, little will change. And it's very possible, by most recent estimates, that 20 to 40% of remaining US coastal ecosystems will be gone by 2100. So without proactive policy change and political will, it's hard to see how public sentiment will demand protection of coastal ecosystems over coastal development. Thank you.